Hey guys, Heidi Preep here. So, if you thought that the Family Roles series was over, we would be thinking the same thing. However, I was publishing the videos this week and I kept feeling like, okay, there are things that I've left out. There are questions that I feel like these videos raise that I don't necessarily answer within the videos. Maybe no one else feels like that, I don't know, but I felt like that. So I decided that a follow-up video was needed, or 10, we'll see, where we just talk about where these roles come from and also who is to blame for them. Because I think that anytime we start talking about things like attachment, family roles, things that are interpersonal wounds, this very natural question arises of if we want to start healing from these roles, or if we want to start healing from our attachment styles, do we start immediately placing all of the blame on our parents and expecting them to do the work to get us better? And this video is an attempt to answer that question as evenly and fairly and compassionately as possible. So the thing about family roles is that you can't really look at them without looking a couple of generations back, and then a couple of generations back from that, and then a couple of generations back from that. Because while we only have direct experience with our own families, and maybe one or two generations before us, depending on how long your grandparents and great-grandparents were kicking around for, these roles and the specific dysfunctions that we're born into come from a very long line of patterns of behavior, of patterns within our genes, of patterns within hardships and problems that our families have faced. And it's really hard to look at any one family and say that one person is to blame for anything. So when we were talking about the scapegoat and the golden child in previous videos, I felt compelled to expand upon why a parent would ever create a dynamic where one child is a scapegoat and one child is a golden child. And the reason why I wanted to address this further is because when you look at these family roles online, you'll find a lot of videos just simply pinning all of this on the parent being a narcissist or the parent being toxic. But what do those labels really mean? Where do they come from? And how do we work with them? Are the natural questions that get raised out of that, right? Because if we believe that toxic people and narcissists are just magically falling out of the sky, it doesn't really give us much to work with in terms of how to stop that pattern. So I'm going to give you a made-up example to kind of help explain how we can't look at these instances in isolation, okay? So let's say you have a little boy named Johnny, and Johnny is 2 years old, and he came into the world like all children do, with a pure heart and a desire to do good and to please people and to get along happily with his family and his friends. Like every single baby and every single human who comes into this world, he had a very inherent need for love and connection, right? All babies have that. But unfortunately, Johnny was born into a very abusive household. So from the time he was 1 or 2 years old, Johnny's dad used to hit him or beat him up when he was crying, when he expressed a need for comfort, when he wouldn't settle down after he'd been fed. And it didn't really seem to matter what Johnny did or what he tried with his parents, if he tried showing his vulnerability and acting really cute and coy, or if he tried to act tough and like nothing bothered him. There was no really reason or rhyme to why he got beat and why he sometimes didn't. But like I said, Johnny came into the world with a very pure intention to connect and love people and be loved by people. And so the thing that got him through his childhood was this belief that when I grow up, I'm going to do better than my parents did for me, right? I am not going to abuse my children the way that my dad abused me. I'm going to be loving and patient and kind with my children. And I'm gonna prove that I can do things differently and I can break this cycle. So Johnny does all of the things that you would expect a good boy to do. He goes to school and he tries as hard as he can to focus and get good grades, which is hard for him because there's so much chaos at home. But he does everything he can to make his teachers happy. He joins organizations that give him a sense of structure that he doesn't have at home. He becomes a Boy Scout as a child. He joins a youth group as a preteen and becomes involved in the church. And he does everything he can think of to try to be a good boy who does right by other people and not turn into the monster that he perceives his dad to be. Now in high school, Johnny falls in love and he convinces himself, I am not going to have a broken home the way my family was broken. He asks his girlfriend to marry him when they're both 18. At 22, they welcome their first child, and their first child is everything that Johnny had ever hoped and more. So he looks at this child, it's a baby girl, and he goes, I'm going to give this baby girl absolutely everything on earth. And anyone who knows Johnny would tell you he thinks the sun shines out of that baby's ass. He really wants to share the workload with his wife. He wakes up in the middle of the night time and time again with the baby, and as the baby grows up, he's really eager to put her in all of the best programs, give her all of the best opportunities, send her to the best school that he's capable of sending her to, because he is hell-bent on giving this child a better life than the life that he had. Now, so far, the story sounds pretty benign, right? It's a happy story, it's a redemption story, it's a story about a man who is breaking the cycle of abuse in his family and trying to do better by his own children. But what we don't get is the perspective of the child who grows up with this feeling that they don't quite understand, but something tells them, my father's mental health and sense of self is resting upon me being a good, happy kid, right? Because Johnny is so fixated on changing his family history and being the father that his father never was, the baby starts to notice, when I show that I'm happy and smiling and giggling, my dad responds really well to me. But when I show distress, when I show anger, when I show frustration, my dad gets really dysregulated. He might not yell at me, he might not hit me, but he seems stressed. And children who are full of mirror neurons, especially when they're babies, pick up on that distress in parents, right? So this baby is being subtly conditioned to only show positive emotion, to only act like they're happy and everything's good and everything's fine, and they're excelling at preschool and they're excelling at kindergarten and they're excelling at grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3, because they sense that the more they shine and the more that they show to their dad, I am having a perfect childhood, the more regulated their dad stays. And we've talked about this before, a regulated parent is essential to the survival of a child. And children know this without having the language for it. And they will naturally do whatever they feel like they need to do to get consistent caregiving from their parent, which requires a parent who's emotionally stable. Now, let's say Johnny and his wife have a second child. And by this point, Johnny is feeling really confident in his abilities as a parent, right? The first child went swimmingly, so Johnny figures second baby will be a breeze. Now, second baby comes along, and this baby is colicky. This baby, no matter how much he is rocked or soothed or comforted or fed, does not stop crying. So for the first couple of weeks, Johnny and his wife see different parenting experts. They take the baby in for medical tests. They confirm that nothing is physically wrong. And so they just try everything they can think of to try to get the baby to settle. But Johnny, without consciously recognizing it, is getting extremely triggered by the baby's distress. If he were a perfect father, if he were a good, responsive, attuned father, he would know how to settle his baby. And this thought just gnaws at him and gnaws at him as the baby begins to grow up. So he comforts himself by telling himself, this baby just has a different temperament than our first baby. Our first baby, I realize now, was just a good, easy baby. And this baby just has a different kind of wicked temperament about him. But I am a good, patient, virtuous father, so I'm going to do everything within my power to give this second baby all of the same opportunities that the first one had. So Johnny puts the second baby in the same schools, the same sports, the same programs as the first baby, but the second baby isn't quite taking to those activities. In fact, the second baby has a little bit of a rebellious streak, and as he grows up, he often talks back to Johnny. And the more he talks back to Johnny, the more frustrated Johnny gets, because he's doing everything under the sun to give this baby every opportunity he can possibly give him, and yet he doesn't seem to appreciate any of it. And Johnny knows that he's a good father because he gave his first baby all of these opportunities, and she is excelling. She's getting straight A's, she's making her teachers and her coaches and her peers proud, but this second baby is just a little bit of a bad apple. And at this point in the story, we might feel really bad for Johnny, because Johnny truly is trying with his kids. He really wants his second child to have all the same opportunities that his first child had. But now let's look at that second child. Maybe they grow up. They're 30 years old sitting in a therapy room. And they're explaining to their therapist, when I was a young child, I always felt like when I would show any frustration, any anger, any unhappiness, my dad would get really, really out of sorts. It seemed to make him incredibly distressed when I was distressed, and that was scary for me. And sometimes my dad would get really angry and he would blow up, he would scream, he would yell, he would ask me why I just couldn't be like my sister. And then he would tell me I was the reason why he got so angry. I was the reason why he lost his temper. I was the reason why he threw dishes or threatened to abandon me or hit me and told me it was all for my own good. And so anyone who's talking to Johnny's son as an adult is going to have a pretty negative view of Johnny. But let's go back to Johnny's perspective and see what's happening for him in those moments. So when his son grows up and starts talking back to him and starts screaming things like "I hate you" at him, as 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds are wont to do, Johnny might have a PTSD reaction because he's flashing back to his own father screaming at him and yelling at him and telling him derogatory things about himself. And Johnny, not realizing that he's now in a completely different situation, might completely lose it and scream and rage and yell the same way he wanted to as a child but couldn't. And because Johnny so desperately wants to give his children a different childhood than he had, he finds it psychologically intolerable to even think about the fact that he might have some of the anger issues that his father had. So to justify his outbursts, he decides in his own mind that his second child is just ungrateful, a bad kid, they have problems with authority, maybe they have oppositional defiance disorder, and he returns to his role as a virtuous parent by bringing his child into a psychologist and going, "Please fix him." Now, as an adult, Johnny's child might want to point the finger at his father and go, "My father was a narcissist, he was toxic, he was abusive," and it's very possible that some of those traits do apply to Johnny. However, Johnny was not setting out to terrorize his son. He did not wake up in the morning with the intention to make his son's life hell. He actually woke up in the morning, from his perspective, with the intention to do the complete opposite of what his parents did. Now, what he didn't realize was that he was accidentally placing a redemption fantasy onto his own children. So a redemption fantasy is this idea that we hold in our heads about a magical future where a perfect, harmonious relationship that we have is going to replace all of the pain of our past. And Johnny really did believe in this story, that if he could just give his kids a happy childhood, then it would be objectively confirmed that he was a good person, like he had spent his entire life trying to become. So what he accidentally did was create a golden child out of his first child and a scapegoat out of his second child. All of his good qualities, all of the things he wanted to believe about himself that were positive, he saw in his first child, who was feeding back to him the idea that he was a perfect parent. And all of the things that were bad about himself that he could not admit to himself as being traits that he possessed, like rage and anger and frustration and impatience, he just decided were his son's traits, and he was simply reacting to his bad, no good son. Now, where is the truth, right? The truth is that Johnny has both wonderful intentions and unresolved trauma that hijacks his brain and ends in him abusing his child the same way his dad abused him, but denying that it's happening. And if we were to go back one generation, we would find something in Johnny's father's history that made the way that he was abusing Johnny make sense to him within his own mind. So here's the interesting part about all of this. To be a cycle breaker in the truest sense of the word, you cannot have the intention to never do anything wrong, right? Because that is a redemption fantasy. It's looking at this magical future where you will somehow be so good that you are not human, that you are more Christ-like or God-like, or your child is more Christ-like or God-like than human, right? Breaking the cycle of trauma means being able to look at yourself as having impulses towards kindness and generosity and connection, and also impulses towards anger and frustration and intolerance, and being able to work with yourself in an honest way. So let's orient ourselves back in time and space and talk about the family roles. So let's say you really recognize yourself in the role of the family hero, or the role of the scapegoat, or the role of the golden child. And the natural question that comes up is, do I blame my parent? And the answer is, you could blame your parent, but then who do they blame? Their parents, I guess, right? And then their parents, well, why are they messed up? Well, I guess they have to blame their parents. And then we end up going back generations and generations and generations, and where does it end, right? We end up blaming Adam and Eve, and then who is their dysfunctional parent, right? So it's all God's fault. It becomes this absolutely ridiculous goose chase trying to figure out where the problem started. But I can already hear some of the protests at this point of what? So we should just forgive our parents? So we should just not hold them responsible for any abuse or any mistreatment or any wrongdoings against us? That's also not what I'm saying. So if we're looking at how much blame should we place on the parents, there are a couple of questions that I think need to be considered first. One, what purpose does blaming the parents serve? And the answer to this is very important, because do we need to contextualize our trauma? Yes, absolutely. It is not helpful for us to look at the way we turned out and not consider what led us there. Which biases did our parents have? Which trauma responses did they inherit that they played out on us that shaped us to be the way that we are now? We need to understand that. Otherwise, we will take on blame where blame is not due. This is especially prevalent for the scapegoat who grew up thinking that they are bad, they are flawed, they are worthless, they are scum, but not really knowing why they thought that, right? But it applies to all roles. When you start to understand all of that was projections of what my parent couldn't accept was within themselves that they placed onto me instead, then you become free of that, right? You can choose to step out of that role and create your own identity. So in that sense, contextualizing where your trauma came from can be extraordinarily helpful. However, there's a point at which this process stops being helpful. And where it stops being helpful is the point at which we decide it is not our responsibility to fix our own trauma because we didn't inflict it on ourselves, right? So if you're expecting your parents to turn around and go, oh my God, I've seen the error of my ways, I'm the reason for all of your problems, let me fix it for you, you are living in your own redemption fantasy. And that is keeping you stuck in a cycle of delusion and pain. And at this point, I want to acknowledge I'm a master's student of psychology. I'm not a registered clinician, so the advice that I'm giving is not clinical advice. I highly encourage you to seek out a mental health professional who can help you process these roles. And anything that I'm telling you is solely based on what I have learned through my own healing process. Actually, that's not true. A lot of it is stuff I've read in books, but I will reference the books when and where that applies. Now, before we go further, I want to acknowledge that it might actually be difficult for you to either blame or remove blame from your parent based on your attachment style, because if you are avoidantly attached, you have a tendency, by virtue of the way that your worldview formed before the age of 2, to take on responsibility for things that are not yours. So you might truly believe, my parent was just punishing me for my own good. My parent was a saint. My parent did everything right by me. I just should have behaved better. I shouldn't have acted out. It was my fault. And every punishment they doled out really grew me into a stronger person. And this worldview can function to the point of delusion. I remember one time having a conversation with a very avoidantly attached person who was explaining to me that their parent was so compassionate and so kind that they would never take them or any of their siblings to the doctor when they were really ill because they didn't want to bother the doctor, and wasn't that so virtuous of their parent? And I was like, okay, well, that was child neglect, but I will let you work that one out for yourself in therapy. So avoidants tend to naturally overtake responsibility and believe that the abuse that happened to them was their own fault. And so when they see other people complaining about being abused, their natural impulse is to go, all these people are just playing the victim. Same thing that happened to them happened to me and I'm fine. You might get that attitude in the adult worldview of Johnny's golden child. On the other side of things, anxiously attached people tend to naturally divide the world into pure evil villains and pure good victims. And the reason this happens is because when they were young, they were raised in an unpredictable environment, okay? So dad comes home, kicks his boots off, looks upset. Some days that means a beating. Other days it means he's gonna wrap them up in a giant bear hug and take them out for ice cream. So trying to guess what their parent was thinking was almost impossible to do, so they didn't bother learning that skill. So as an adult, it can be difficult still for the anxiously attached person to understand that the way they're feeling is not necessarily an accurate representation of what is factually happening in their environment. So what that means is there's this belief that negative intent must be behind negative action. So if you have an anxiously attached wound, it might be really difficult for you to try to hold this idea of your parent or your abuser as a complex individual in your mind. And that is something that 100% you will need professional help working through. And this might also raise the question, well, why should we forgive our abusive parents? Brilliant psychologists have tackled this question for ages. I highly recommend John Bradshaw. Healing the Shame That Binds You, in particular, is an excellent, excellent book for anyone who is consciously coping with the wounds of an abusive parent. And that can be any form of abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, psychological. And also Pete Walker, the book Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving, has some incredible resources in it for dealing with the after effects of growing up in a dysfunctional family. But I believe it's John Bradshaw who talks about how rushing to forgive your parents or your abusers can actually be a sign of trying to bypass the work, right? So I believe it was him who said that you should forgive only after you are no longer hurting. So your role as an adult is to work with a therapist, a support group, mental health services to help you resolve and start healing the pain of the family dynamic that you grew up in. And I plug this almost every video, but I'm going to plug it again here. Adult Children of Alcoholics is a wonderful, free 12-step support group for anyone who's grown up in a dysfunctional dynamic. It does not have to be an alcoholic home. You could have completely sober parents and still attend this support group, and it would still cater to you. It's a wonderful resource where they talk about the long-term effects of childhood dysfunction and how to show up differently as an adult who's been through it. So the question of, do you forgive your parents, becomes a dual-part question. One, where are you at in your healing journey? Are you just starting to recognize that what happened to you was abuse? Maybe it's not time to forgive. Maybe it will never be time to forgive for you. Or maybe down the line, you'll start to see both your abuse and your parents' abuse and their parents' abuse before them, and you'll naturally feel more forgiving. The dynamics of forgiveness or not forgiveness, of contact or no contact, and all of the intricacies in between are completely personal, and they have to be worked out by you in a timeline that works for you, right? I would never tell anyone, forgive your abusive parent or don't forgive your abusive parent. That is so personal. That is so dependent on context and situation. And that's something that you and the mental health professional who is helping you have to figure out together what's going to be best for your healing. But this question of should we blame the parents is such a vital one to ask at any stage of the healing process. And at different stages of the healing process, it's probably going to mean different things to you, right? At one point, it might mean contextualizing the situation and going, I'm going to look at my parent as both a victim and an abuser in order to understand what happened to them and the sequence of events that led them to abuse that I don't want to follow, right? That's the most important part. If we are looking at our parents as all bad and narcissists or villains, we're going to miss the warning signs that they also missed in ourselves, right? That was Johnny's problem. He looked at his dad as purely evil. So he didn't look at what warning signs might have gone off for my dad. Where could he have stopped? And so he didn't notice those warning signs when they came up for him, right? When we learn what sequence of events led our parents to abuse, we can start to recognize that sequence of events if it's happening for us. So the end point of this has nothing to do with your parents, right? We're focusing on you and how you can grow and how you can become the best version of yourself and how you cannot pass on the legacy of abuse, and understanding that legacy of abuse, understanding that intergenerational trauma, understanding what it was that caused all of these people who came before you and your family to act a certain way can really help you understand how not to perpetuate it, right? Because delusional fantasies about being a good person all of the time do not work. They just do not. We are all people with tempers, with flaws, with challenges, with things that make us angry and irrational and upset. And if we are unwilling to look at those things within ourselves and notice when they're coming up for us and when we're in the danger zone of repeating that cycle of trauma, we absolutely cannot fix it. Inside of all of us is a desire to do good and be virtuous, and also a desire to act out in anger and fear when we feel threatened. An awareness of both helps us to nurture the one that we want to nurture, which is the stable, rational part of ourselves who sees even ourselves as both good and bad and is having the opportunity in every moment to choose which impulse to act on. I feel like I got off topic in this, but I don't think I did. I think that all ties back in. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we put all of the blame on someone else, what we're often doing is putting ourselves in pure victim mode and the other person in pure abuser mode. And while that can be a helpful step for sure in the healing process, there also is a very dry, unemotional sequence of events that we can access to help us understand how trauma's gotten passed down intergenerationally. And if we aren't taking the time to understand that and to understand that all abusers are usually in some form victims of some other trauma themselves, then we don't know how to stop the cycle. Like, we don't have the information we need, right? So I'm not telling you don't blame your parents. I'm not telling you don't get mad about your abuse. But what I'm saying is we should contextualize the parents. And we should use that information to contextualize ourselves and our own responses and our own impulses. Because that context allows us to be accurate in our thinking. And only accurate thinkers are going to be able to break the cycles. Otherwise, we're all just Johnny, right? Allowing our well-intentioned idealism to perpetuate a cycle of trauma and abuse. Okay, that's all I have for today. This was an inflammatory subject, probably. So if there's anything that you want clarification on in terms of what I was implying, please let me know. I feel like this video is going to be easy to misinterpret, but maybe I'm wrong. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I will provide lots of resources for anyone who has been through dysfunctional family abuse in any form, because this is a very serious topic, and if you have been through this, you absolutely need help. No exceptions. I don't care who you are. I don't care how mentally strong you think you are. You need help to overcome interpersonal trauma. That's just how it works. All right, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I will see you back here soon.